Associated Press, on the Dr. Phil Show, and also with Anderson Cooper 360. Let's give him a warm welcome this morning.
So yeah, I am the executive director of the Gay Christian Network. I was not going to mention the conference, but since it was mentioned, thank you so much. Since it was mentioned, I'll say right now, this is already open, so I don't know what's in. I tried. Oh, is it champagne? Okay, great. But since it was mentioned, I'll say right off the bat, yeah, our conference is going to be in Phoenix. It's usually the first weekend, Thursday through Sunday of the year. We like to kick the year off with the conference, and it's an awesome time. But the problem is, over the last few years, that weekend has crept closer and closer to New Year's. And trying to have a conference right at New Year's is not a good thing. So this year, we're going to be bumping it to the second weekend in January. So it'll be that Thursday through Sunday. That I don't remember the dates off the top of my head, but it's that second Thursday through Sunday in January in Phoenix. We would love to have you. So I also have a book coming out in November, which I'm very excited about, called Torn, Rescuing the Gospel from the Gays versus Christians Debate. I'm really excited about it for a lot of reasons, but also I should mention my publisher, who's really, really cool, is a brand new imprint called Jericho Books, and they are a Christian publisher focusing on books that are challenging the status quo in the church and sort of pushing the envelope a little bit, but in ways that are explicitly Christian, and I really, really appreciate that about them. So that's a little bit about me. But before any of that, back in the day, I used to wait tables. Did any of you ever wait tables? Okay, a few of you. The rest of you, ask these folks before you go out to eat what it's like. It's a fun experience. I used to wait tables, and when the first restaurant I ever worked in, I was talking to folks about sort of, our schedules and stuff. And I didn't like having to work Sunday mornings because I wanted to be able to go to church. But because nobody wanted to work Sunday mornings, I sometimes had to. And I was sort of intrigued by this because a lot of the other folks who didn't want to work on Sundays were not particularly religious at all. And so I said, how come nobody wants to work on Sundays? And this one server said, oh, honey, you got to understand. Sunday is when the church crowd goes out to eat, and that is the absolute worst time to be a server. I said, well, why is that? She said, Christian folk don't tip. They already gave at church. They don't have any money left. And so I promise you, on Sunday morning, if you see the people at your table praying before the meal, you can mentally deduct a third from what you expect to get in. Sometimes, not only did I find this to be true, sadly, but sometimes Christians would leave tips that included these tracts that looked like money. So you go to your table after your folks have left, and there's what looks like a high-value bill on the table. And you pick it up, and it's a tract telling you about Jesus. This is not great witnessing, folks, in case you weren't aware. I was at a conference recently that was an LGBT political conference, and there was a group of gay Christians there that had a table. They weren't GCN, it was another group. And they told me that while I was speaking in another room, that some Christians from a neighboring conference came by and dropped off tracts that also didn't look like tracts. They looked like some kind of puzzle, but then you turn it over and the answer was Jesus, And one of the guys at the table referred to this as, surprise, it's Jesus. And I thought surprise, it's Jesus would make a great title for a children's book, like a pop-up book maybe, and you turn the page, surprise, it's Jesus. we brainstormed about some of the other children's books that could be in this series, like One Fish, Two Fish, Feed 5,000, and the Jesus at the end of this book, Cloudy with a Chance of Jesus, Are You My Savior, those of you who've read those books, you know what I'm talking about. But the thing is, this kind of approach to the gospel leaves a bad taste in the mouths of those who encounter it. It is not a great way of witnessing in our culture. And in fact, it gives non-Christians a really terrible impression of Christians. My good friend Nathan Gunter wrote a column for GCN back in the early days of the organization that's still on our website called Queer as Faith. And my favorite edition of Queer as Faith that he ever wrote was called Bible Bar. And he talked in this about this sort of Christian consumerism that exists. And he says, when I see the things everyone in America uses and enjoys every single day slapped with a Christian label, I want to throw up. Do we really need Christian candy? What, in the end, does it do for our witness to have testaments sitting on our coffee tables? And he talks about walking into a Christian bookstore and all of the examples of this that he saw that drove him crazy. And then he says, it struck me like a bolt of lightning. Bottles of nutritional supplements with Bible verses explaining why Scripture tells believers apparently to take these capsules full of olive oil twice daily with water and or food. Paintings of biblical figures and promises that God will bless your life if you pop these Christian vitamins. I would have walked by except for the one thing I couldn't ignore. All I know is I saw this one small display on the shelf and immediately was on the floor, half laughing, half crying, half wanting to begin turning over tables like Jesus in the temple. That passed and I stood to verify that I wasn't crazy. The display read, Bible Bar, helps control appetite. A picture of Jesus looked up at me from the Christian power bar, his humble eyes imploring me to drop those few extra holiday pounds. He had, after all, shed his blood for me. It was the least I could do. With Bible Bar, I can move the mountains that are my love handles. When I was a kid, we had Christian video games, and one of the Christian video games was a game called Spiritual Warfare. It was a ripoff of Nintendo's popular game, The Legend of Zelda, and it was almost identical to The Legend of Zelda. But in The Legend of Zelda, you were on a quest to save a princess. In Spiritual Warfare, you were on a quest against the powers of darkness. In The Legend of Zelda, you collected various weapons to use in your quest. And in Spiritual Warfare, you collected the fruits of the Spirit. Only they were actual fruits, apples and pomegranates and bananas and this sort of thing. And when you encountered your enemies, which in The Legend of Zelda were monsters, but in Spiritual Warfare were the unsaved. Yes. When you encountered the unsaved, you threw the fruit of the Spirit at them. Or blew them up with vials of God's wrath. I'm not making this up. At which point they would instantly drop to their knees, convert, and disappear. Now, I appreciate that there were folks who wanted to instill Christian principles in the youth of America, but I don't think that's the right way to go about it, and I don't think that's the right message. But I think that, unfortunately, it says a lot about what's wrong in the church in America today. Now, I don't want to focus on what's wrong in the church in America today, because I love the church. I love the church in America. I love the global church. I love the experiences I have in churches of different denominations and different approaches to the gospel. I love the gospel, and I love that we are a body of fallible human believers and that God somehow works through us. But I do think we have to do a little self-examination once in a while. You know, we have become at times a very polarized church, a very polarized body of believers. And we do sometimes become a little bit legalistic. There's a famous story, many of you have probably heard, a joke really, about a devout Christian driving down the highway who encounters a jumper looking over the side of a bridge. And the motorist, horrified, pulls over and jumps out and says, "What are you doing?" And the guy says, "I have nothing left to live for." And the motorist says, "But surely you have something to live for. Do you believe in God?" The jumper says, "Well, yes, I do actually. I do believe in God." And the motorist says, "Well, so do I. What religion are you? Are you a Muslim? Are you a Christian? Are you Jewish?" He says, "I'm a Christian." And the motorist says, "I am too. What denomination?" And he says, "Well, I'm Baptist, actually." And the motorist says, "How about that? We're both Baptists. It's fantastic. What are you? Are you a Southern Baptist, American Baptist, Northern Baptist, Reformed Baptist?" He says, "I'm a Reformed Baptist, actually." And he says, "What are the odds? So am I. We're both Reformed. Well, so are you Reformed Baptist Church of God or Reformed Baptist Church of the Lord?" He says, "I'm Reformed Baptist Church of the Lord." He says, "I am too. Get out of here. Are you Reformed Baptist Church of the Lord Reformation of 1816 or Reformed Baptist Church of the Lord Reformation of 1923? And he says, "Well, I'm Reformed Baptist Church of the Lord Reformation of 1923. And so the motorist said, "Die, heretic," and pushes him over the bridge. Philip Yancey talks about a little girl who prays, "Dear God, may the bad people be good and the good people be nice." There's a horrible reputation that the church has in America today, and many of you may have heard about the study that was done a few years ago by the Barna Group, looking at what today's young Americans think about the church. And they asked young Americans between the ages of 16 and 29 to choose words and phrases that represented modern-day Christianity. They had a lot of choices. Good things like teaches good values, bad things like hypocritical and out of touch. And out of just all of these different things that could be said, the number one response of today's young people was not any of them. It was that the church is anti-gay. It was the number one thing. 91% of non-Christian young people in this study said that the church was anti-gay, and 80% of church-going Christian young people said that modern Christianity is anti-gay. And the researchers were shocked that this was the most salient thing about Christianity among young people today. Now, one of the things that I love about this church that I've heard from a number of you is that this is a church that a lot of LGBT folks feel safe attending and do attend, and it's a church that doesn't focus on LGBT stuff, which I think is wonderful. Sometimes churches want so badly to be welcoming to the LGBT community that every sermon is about LGBT stuff, and then it's sort of like, well, where's the gospel? There's a gospel in here somewhere, I hope. But I also think that sometimes it's important for us to talk about this stuff, not because many of the people in this room are LGBT, but because we're Christians. And this is the reputation that we have, is that we are the anti-gay, anti-LGBT folks. And you all know that this is not true. There were a couple of pastors in my home state of North Carolina recently who made news in separate instances. Many of you have probably heard about this. One of them preached a sermon in which he said that a child, a boy who displayed feminine characteristics should be physically abused, basically slapped and have his wrist broken in order to straighten him out. Another pastor suggested that gay people ought to be put in essentially concentration camps. And these videos of these pastors saying these things went viral and made national news. And I was talking to a friend of mine about this. And I said, well, you do understand that these folks don't represent all of Christendom. you do understand that these folks don't represent Christianity. They don't represent Christians in America. They don't even represent Baptists in North Carolina, I say as somebody from North Carolina who grew up Southern Baptist. And he said, well, I'm not so sure about that. And I said, no, I know so many Christians who don't agree with these folks. I mean, they represent a minority viewpoint. Even among those who don't approve of same-sex marriage, these views are in the minority. And my friend said, well, if views like that are so in the minority, how come I don't hear a lot of Christians speaking out when this kind of stuff happens? How come I hear a lot of LGBT folks speaking out? I hear the news media speaking out. I hear a lot of non-Christians speaking out, but I don't hear a lot of Christians confronting their own and publicly saying this is wrong. We as Christians believe this is wrong. Now, you and I know that there are Christians who have spoken out and continue to speak out, but so often we don't, or at least we're not being heard. For all of the focus that the church does sometimes on issues like same-sex marriage, it's worth pointing out that Jesus spent the bulk of his time with the people who his culture treated as outcasts and sinners. And Jesus saved his harsh words for two situations, and both of them were related to people keeping other people from coming to God. The money changers in the temple who had set up their shop in the only area of the temple that was reserved for the Gentiles to worship, who basically didn't care that they were preventing Gentiles from being able to come to God in the way that God intended, and the Pharisees, who, as very holy men, or very devout men, I should say, were looking down on everybody else. It's easy for us to sort of treat the Pharisees as the enemies, the villains of the story. But the thing about the Pharisees is the Pharisees were devout. I mean, there were no Christians, of course, at this time. Jesus hadn't died yet. The Pharisees were Jews. Jesus was a Jew. The Pharisees were devout followers of God who knew the scriptures back and forth, and they were, in many ways, the equivalent of today's Christian teachers and leaders and preachers and televangelists and whatnot. And Jesus says of the Pharisees, do not do what they do. Now tell me if this sounds like any Christians today. Do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads and put them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. Woe to you! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Sons of hell, he called them. If the Son of God calls you son of hell, just a hint, that may not be a good thing. There's a movie I saw a few years ago where the hero, the protagonist, becomes convinced that some people have a bomb, some terrorists have planted a bomb in a van. And he alone knows about it, and he alone can stop this bomb from reaching its destination. But the police don't believe him, nobody believes him, and so he goes on this journey chasing this van through traffic, speeding around roadblocks and past the police and all of this stuff to stop the van. And the van gets to its destination, and he pulls in right behind it and jumps out screaming and yelling and saying, "The bomb is in the van, you've got to get the bomb out of the van." And people don't believe him, and finally somebody goes and they check and they open the van and there's no bomb there. And it's only then, at the final moment, in the shocking climax of the film that he realizes he's been tricked. The bomb was in his car, and he just brought it to the very destination that the terrorists wanted. In trying to stop what he thought was the enemy, he has himself committed the act of terrorism. We Christians in the church today are the ones who are destroying Christianity in America. So many Christians are so focused on trying to root out any hint of sin or immorality in the church that we've destroyed our reputation, we've destroyed each other, we've ripped each other to shreds, we're shoving people off the bridge because we don't agree with them on everything. And we can see it in other Christians who do it to us, and sometimes we fail to recognize that this is a message that God has for us as well. That we must be cautious about the way we treat one another. Paul in 1 Timothy writes about his big concern, a message he's heard from the Spirit about the problem that the church will face in the future. And he writes this: the Spirit clearly says that in later times some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. Such teachings come through hypocritical liars whose consciences have been seared as with a hot iron. How do we know this threat? They forbid people to marry and order them to abstain from certain foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and who know the truth. For everything God created is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, because it is consecrated by the word of God and prayer. In other words, Paul was concerned not that the church was going to, at least in this passage, not that the church was going to become too immoral and too worldly, but that we were going to become too legalistic. And that this was going to tear us apart. And that this was going to destroy the message of the gospel. So how do we respond to this legalism in the church? How do we respond to the polarization that exists? Well, we yell and scream and tear people apart, right? No, Jesus says, if somebody hits you on one cheek, turn the other cheek, right? If somebody persecutes you, what do? You love them. You love those who persecute you. There are a lot of different opinions in the church on issues like same-sex marriage and all of that, and not everybody who disagrees with me or with you is acting out of prejudice or hate, although some are. There are many Christians who honestly come to a different conclusion on any number of theological issues. And we have to love one another in those situations. Paul writes about just such a situation in Romans 14. You remember one of the big controversies in the early church was about eating meat that had been sacrificed to idols. Remember this? Because this was the big thing that was tearing apart the church, was, can you eat this meat that's sold in the marketplace that's been sacrificed to idols? And Paul says, look, some of you think that it's okay, some of you think that it's wrong. Here's what I say. Accept the one whose faith is weak, without quarreling over disputable matters. One person's faith allows him to eat anything, but another whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The one who eats everything must not treat with contempt the one who does not, and the one who does not eat everything must not judge the one who does, for God has accepted them. Who are you to judge someone else's servant? To their own master servants stand or fall, and they will stand, for the Lord is able to make them stand. Romans 14. In other words, Paul, notice what he does. He's not taking a position. He actually does take a position. He says, I think that there's nothing wrong with eating this meat. But he also says, if you agree that there's nothing wrong with it, don't look down on those who think there is something wrong with it. Allow them to live out their consciences. And if you think that there's something wrong with it, don't judge those who think there's not. God has accepted them. Each person has to be fully convinced in their own mind. And we need to love one another. Tony Campolo says, I often hear people say, love the sinner but hate the sin. This is my Tony Campolo impersonation, by the way. I often hear people say, love the sinner but hate the sin. And I say, Well, that's interesting because that's the opposite of what Jesus said. Jesus never said, love the sinner but hate his sin. Jesus said, love the sinner and hate your own sin. I love that about Tony. And then, of course, while we sit here thinking, yeah, I know some people who need to hear that, we're sort of sitting in judgment on them and looking down on them, aren't we? For those of us who are LGBT, who have friends and family members who have been judged by others in the church and outside the church because of who we are, because of what we believe, it's worth remembering that the folks God uses most often to make change in the church and in the world are those who are persecuted. Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery, and he ends up, because of that, in a position to make a difference for people throughout the land. Queen Esther is sort of in the closet as a Jew, watching potential persecution of her people, and because of the position that she's in, she's able to do something about it. Jesus is arrested and nailed to a cross and crucified. And his enemies surely thought that this was the best thing for them and the worst thing for him. And yet we Christians celebrate that every day of our lives. That God brought out of that the most important thing. God sacrificed his son, and Jesus sacrificed his life, and we are called upon to sacrifice and to be persecuted. And that persecution and that oppression is what strengthens our faith. Mary Tyler Moore once said, "Pain nourishes courage. You can't be brave if you've only had wonderful things happen to you." When I was a kid, I was in Sunday school once, and they taught us, they teach a lot of children's songs to kids, and I guess that's a good time to teach children's songs to kids. Anyway, they teach a lot of these little songs, and there was this one song that I learned in Sunday school that I think is the worst children's song I've ever heard. And it was like this. It was, if I had a little white box to put my Jesus in, they'd take him out and put him right back in. What? And then there's another verse that if I had a box to put the devil in, I'd take him out and smash his face. And then that's even... We're teaching this to kids. Now, somebody later told me that they didn't teach me the right words, that it was supposed to be take him out and share him with my friends. That's not that much better, honestly. Why is Jesus in a box to begin with? And why do we think that Christianity consists of taking out this little Jesus and going, little kisses, like what? But we risk becoming that in the church if we don't have to struggle and fight for our faith. And we do. And everybody in this room has had to struggle and fight in one way or another. And maybe there still are times that it's been hard for you to be a Christian because other Christians don't agree with you on things, or because you see these negative images that exist in the culture of Christianity. You hear things like these pastors preaching hate, and see Christians not tipping on Sundays, and see Christians who persecute LGBT people and all this stuff. And there are times that you think, what am I doing this for? But the thing about it is, that's when we recognize that our faith is in God, not in other people. And so many Christians who've never had to go through those struggles, have never had to fight for their faith, have never had to grow, and they're still living out this faith that consists of Christian video games and Bible bar and taking Jesus out of a box and giving him little kisses. And that's not the gospel, because the gospel is about a God who sacrificed in the ultimate way for us, and a people who sacrifice in the ultimate way for each other and for God, because this is who we are as Christians. the church is divided, it's polarized in a way that reminds me sometimes of the old Miller Lite beer commercials. Tastes great, less filling. Do you remember this? These beer commercials where you've got two people both drinking the same brand of beer. And one of them says, well, it tastes great. And the other one says, no, it's less filling. And so they start battling it out about whether it tastes great or is less filling. And the joke is, of course, they both like the same brand. And of course, according to Miller Lite tastes great and is less filling. I don't know, I don't drink it, so. But the church is sort of in this situation where we've got some parts of the church shouting God's truth, and some parts shouting more loving. We've got churches on one side saying, no, we need to be more moral, we need to focus on truth, we need to focus on righteousness, we need to weed out the sin in the church and in the culture. And we've got other Christians shouting, no, we need to be more loving, we need to be more accepting, we need to be more whatever. And yet many of these Christians on both sides have missed the point, because the Christians who are so focused on truth have forgotten a lot of times about how to be loving, and some of the Christians who focus on talking about being loving don't get that being loving goes along with God's truth. I was at a church recently, well, I can tell you a bunch of stories here, but I was at a church where I heard a sermon on the feeding of the 5,000, where the point of the sermon was that maybe Jesus didn't perform a supernatural miracle. Maybe people, when Jesus shared the loaves and the fishes, people all had bits of food under their cloaks and they started to share. And so Jesus didn't work a miracle, he taught people to share. While it's great that people would learn to share, the gospel writers make clear that this miracle was understood as a miracle, as something supernatural occurring. And if we just want to have an easy faith that sort of fits with everything that is easy for people in our culture to believe, and we take out anything in the Bible that is difficult or challenging to us, we miss the God's truth piece of things. And so we've got two sides of the church that are kind of at war with each other, and they both miss the point. It's like the Greek myth where the hero is facing off against giants, and so he pitches a stone into the midst of them, and they all think that somebody else hit them, and so they kill each other off. We must be the ones to combine the truth and the love and live it out every day. That's the gospel. At the end of the day, on all the issues that divide us as Christians, from LGBT issues to baptism to the Eucharist or Lord's Supper or communion or whatever you want to call it. I mean, is it wine? Is it grape juice? Is it literally the blood of Jesus? Is it a symbol? All of the things that divide us as Christians. I have a lot of questions. I can't give you all the answers. If I thought I could, then I probably wouldn't be the person you should be listening to. But there's one thing I do know, and that is that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your mind and heart and soul and strength. And Jesus says to Peter, do you love me? Then feed my sheep. Over and over he says this, do you love me? Feed my sheep. In the story of the sheep and the goats, Jesus says that what you did for the least of these is what you did for me. If you love me, then you love my people. And that's why he says, the greatest commandment is love the Lord your God, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And who's my neighbor? The person who doesn't agree with you just as much as the person who does. So I leave you with this. How often do we show our love for one another? How often do we live out the gospel in that way? How often do we really challenge this perception in our culture that exists of Christians by showing people what it is to be the most loving people on the planet? Spending our time and our money and our effort and our energy and our compassion and all that we have to love people, to expecting nothing in return. How often do you do that? Now, you can probably think of some times that you've done that. I hope you can. If you can't, but hopefully you can think of some times that you've been loving to people, that you've been generous to people. But do you catch yourself thinking, I was really generous that day. Man, I'm a good person. Because that day I was really generous to that person. Or do you find yourself thinking, this is how I should be all the time. This is who God calls me to be all the time. And I fall short, and God keeps forgiving me for it, but I keep wanting pushing on and doing better. And being like that every moment, all of the time. I want to be that loving to people. And my second question is, not only how often, but to whom? When you think about that time you were really generous to that person, who was that person? Was it your friend? Family member? Because, yeah, you should be generous to your friends and family members, but the Bible says, even the heathens love the people who love them. As Christians, we're called to love our enemies, to love those who persecute us, to love those who don't treat us well. And how often are we that generous and loving to them? Jesus said that his followers would be known by their love. May it be so. May we be the ones to make it happen.